Imagine the Pacific Ocean. Vast, deep, silent. Now, imagine 4 steel colossi cutting through its waters. 4 floating cities of war, crowned with flight decks from which death took off. They are the vanguard of an empire, the embodiment of naval power. Their names echo with the force of dragons. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. To the world, in mid-1942, they were invincible. A force of nature as unyielding as a tsunami. Now, imagine the unthinkable. Imagine these 4 giants, the beating heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy, disappearing beneath the dark waves of the Pacific. Not in a campaign of months, not in a week of fierce fighting, but in a single day. In the span of a few hours, a power that took a generation to build was annihilated. This is not war fiction. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, a confrontation where fate was decided not only by the force of cannons or the skill of pilots, but by the power of a single deciphered message, the instinct of a lost pilot, and 5 fateful minutes that changed the course of World War II forever. This is the story of how blind arrogance, surprising intelligence, and how in the middle of the world's largest ocean, a sleeping giant finally awoke to deliver a fatal blow.
To understand the magnitude of the fall, we first need to climb to the summit of Japanese arrogance. In early 1942, Japan was not only winning the war, it was rewriting the map of the Pacific with terrifying speed and efficiency. The flag of the rising sun was raised over a dizzying succession of victories. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the British impregnable fortress, the Dutch East Indies with their vital oil, the Philippines, Burma. An empire rose upon the ruins of the Western colonial powers. The force behind this relentless expansion was the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Teikoku Kaigun. Its ships were superb, its tactics innovative, and its sailors forged in iron discipline. But the jewel in its crown was its naval aviation. Japanese pilots were not novices. They were veterans, hardened by years of brutal combat in the Second Sino-Japanese War. They lived and breathed aerial combat. They flew in a machine that seemed to have been created by the gods of war, the Mitsubishi A6M, the Zero. Light, incredibly agile, and with a formidable range, the Zero danced in the skies, outmaneuvering any fighter the Allies could put in its path. For an American or British pilot at the start of the war, encountering a squadron of Zeros was a death sentence. This uninterrupted sequence of victories generated something as dangerous as any enemy fleet, Shoribyo, the victory sickness. The Japanese High Command and the nation as a whole began to believe in their own propaganda of invincibility. They saw their adversaries, especially the Americans, as materialistic, individualistic, and weak, incapable of enduring a long and bloody war. Arrogance became doctrine. They underestimated American industrial capacity and, more importantly, their adaptability and will to fight. For them, the war was practically already won. All that was missing was one final blow, a checkmate that would force the United States to accept the new order in the Pacific. And that blow would be delivered on a god-forsaken atoll called Midway.
December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a masterpiece of audacity and military precision, From a tactical standpoint, it was a resounding success. American warships, the pride of their fleet, were transformed into twisted hulls and watery graves. American aviation at the base was decimated on the ground. The objective of crippling the Pacific Fleet seemed to have been achieved. But amidst the smoke and carnage lay a monumental strategic miscalculation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect of the attack, ironically was one of those who most feared American power. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and knew the industrial capacity of the United States. There are accounts that he said, "I fear that all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill it with a terrible determination." He was right. The attack did not break the American spirit, it forged it in steel. The nation, previously divided by isolationism, united overnight with a vengeful fervor. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a battle cry. And crucially, the attack failed in its most important objective. By sheer chance, the three aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, were not in port that day. These three ships, previously seen as supporting pieces for the battleships, suddenly became the center of all American naval strategy. They were the only thing left, the only weapon capable of projecting power thousands of miles and taking the fight to Japan. Pearl Harbor was not the end of the American Navy in the Pacific. It was the end of the battleship era and the baptism of fire of the aircraft carrier era. The giant was not only awake, he was now furious and knew exactly which weapon to use for retaliation. While America rearmed, a different war was being fought. A silent war, fought not on bloody decks, but in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, nicknamed the Dungeon. There, a team of naval cryptanalysts known as Station HY-Pi worked day and night on a seemingly impossible task, breaking the Japanese naval code, JN-25. The man leading this team was an eccentric and brilliant figure, Commander Joseph Rochefort. He showed up to work in pajamas and slippers, but his mind was as lethal a weapon as any torpedo. Rochefort and his team didn't break the code completely, but they got far enough. They began to read fragments, to understand patterns, to fish out vital information in a sea of coded messages. By mid-May 1942, these fragments began to paint an alarming picture. Intelligence indicated that the Japanese were planning a massive operation far larger than any before. The target, they knew, was a location the Japanese called AF. But what was AF? Most intelligence in Washington believed it could be California or perhaps Hawaii again. But Rochefort and his team at Pearl Harbor had a strong hunch. They were convinced that AF was Midway Atoll. To prove his theory, Rochefort devised a brilliant ruse. He instructed the garrison at Midway to send an unencrypted message via submarine cable stating that their water purification system had broken down and that they were low on drinking water. It was bait. And the Japanese took it. A few days later, Rochefort's team intercepted a coded Japanese message. The contents were a godsend. AF is running low on water. The trap was confirmed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now knew not only the target, but also had an idea of the composition and timeline of the Japanese attack force.
Admiral Yamamoto's plan for Midway was complex, audacious, and, at its core, a reflection of the victory sickness. He believed he could dictate the terms of the battle, forcing the Americans' hand. The plan had multiple axes: a symphony of naval power designed to confuse and crush. First, a secondary strike force would be sent north to attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. The intention was clear: to create a distraction, drawing part of the American fleet away from the true battlefield, dividing its already meager forces. While the Americans were looking north, the true strike force, the 1st Air Fleet, the feared Kido Butai, under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would approach Midway from the northwest. Its 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would launch a massive air attack to annihilate the island's defenses. With the island neutralized, a large invasion fleet with more than 5,000 soldiers would approach to take the atoll. Yamamoto believed that faced with the imminent loss of Midway, the remaining American aircraft carriers would have no choice but to leave Pearl Harbor and rush into battle. And that was exactly what he wanted. Hidden behind the horizon would be Yamamoto's main force, with him aboard the super battleship Yamato, the largest warship in the world. This powerful force would intercept and destroy the American aircraft carriers in a decisive confrontation. It would be the end of the line for the American Navy in the Pacific. It was a brilliant, multifaceted plan, a trap within a trap. But it was based on 2 fundamentally flawed premises. The first, that the Americans would know nothing until it was too late. The second, that the Americans would react exactly as he predicted. Thanks to the work of Joseph Rochefort, both premises had already crumbled before the Japanese fleet even set sail. Yamamoto was sailing into a trap he himself had designed, unaware that his enemy was already waiting for him there.
The fate of Midway would be decided in the sky, in duels fought by young men in complex machines of metal and fire. The battle would pit the elites of naval aviation from 2 nations against each other. On the Japanese side, the trio was deadly and battle-proven. The A6M-0 fighter was the king of the skies, a winged samurai. Its maneuverability was legendary, capable of turning and climbing faster than any opponent. The Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber was frighteningly accurate, an aerial scalpel capable of placing bombs on the deck of a moving ship. And the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber was versatile and deadly, the same aircraft that had crippled the fleet at Pearl Harbor. These planes were piloted by men who were the best in the world, veterans with thousands of flight hours and real combat experience. On the American side, the situation was more heterogeneous. The backbone of the fighter defense was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. The Wildcat couldn't maneuver like the Zero. In a one-on-one duel, it was at a disadvantage, but it was robust, heavily armored, and had superior firepower. American pilots learned not to dance with the Zero, but to use hit-and-run tactics like the famous Thatch Weave to exploit the Japanese fighters' weaknesses. The B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers based at Midway were imposing, but their high-altitude bombing doctrine would prove terribly inaccurate against ships maneuvering at high speed. The real drama lay with the carrier-based bombers. The Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber was tragically obsolete, slow, poorly armed, and vulnerable. Sending it against the Japanese fleet was almost a suicide mission, but it was all they had. And then there was the ace up their sleeve, the unsung hero of the battle, the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. It wasn't the fastest or most agile plane, but it was reliable, robust, and, in the hands of a good pilot, incredibly precise. The Dauntless would be the tool that would deliver the killing blow. It was a clash of philosophies, Japanese technical perfection and combat experience against American brute force, resilience, and tactical innovation. On one side, veteran pilots and superb machines. On the other,
Young men with rush training in often inferior planes, but armed with the best intelligence in the world and a desperate determination to turn the tide of the war.
The vast solitude of the Pacific was broken on the morning of June 3, 1942. A PBY Catalina patrol seaplane, on one of its long, monotonous sweeps, spotted the unthinkable. Its radio operator transmitted the message that the entire American command had been anxiously awaiting. Main Fleet sighted. It was the transports of the Japanese invasion force. The gears of battle began to turn. The news electrified Midway. Shortly afterward, a formation of 9 B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers took off from the atoll. They flew toward the contacts, climbing to the safety of their high altitude. Below them, the Japanese fleet looked like a collection of miniatures. The orders were given. The bomb bay doors opened. A cascade of 227-kilogram explosives fell toward the ships. Japanese crews watched the smoke trails of falling bombs, and their ships maneuvered sharply. The water churned with the explosions, but no bomb found its target. The attack was a complete tactical failure. However, it had a profound psychological impact on both sides. For the Americans, it was confirmation that the enemy was exactly where intelligence said it would be. Confidence in Nimitz's plan increased. For the Japanese, the attack confirmed that they had been detected. The element of surprise was fading. But at the same time, the total ineffectiveness of a high-altitude bombing may have dangerously reinforced their sense of security. They survived the attack by the dreaded B-17s without a single scratch. Perhaps the Americans weren't such a big threat after all. The first shot of the battle had been fired, but it served more to confirm preconceptions than to inflict damage. The real storm was yet to come, hidden just below the horizon.
The darkness before dawn on June 4th was torn apart by a sound that had become synonymous with Japanese fury, the roar of hundreds of aircraft engines. At 4:30 a.m., on the decks of the 4 aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai, the order was given, take off. One after another, 108 aircraft, 0 fighters for escort, Val bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers armed with bombs were launched into the night sky. Led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, they formed a massive attack wave and flew eastward toward the small dot on the map that was Midway. On the island, the radar had already screamed the alert. Sirens pierced the morning stillness. Men rushed to their posts. The American pilots, knowing they were outnumbered and in inferior machines, sped to their fighters. 26 Brewster Buffaloes and F-4F Wildcats, many piloted by young Marines, took off to meet the storm. What followed over Midway was a massacre. The Zeros, piloted by aces, descended upon the American fighters. The Buffaloes, nicknamed Flying Coffins, were decimated. The Wildcats fought with desperate courage, but were crushed by the Zeros' numerical and maneuver superiority. Of the 26 fighters that took off, 17 were shot down and 7 severely damaged. With the American escort in tatters, the Japanese bombers had a clear path. They dove over the atoll, turning hangars into fireballs, setting fuel tanks ablaze and cratering the runways. Midway was ablaze. But the island did not break. Anti-aircraft artillery spewed a hellish, dense fire, downing several Japanese bombers. And crucially, the runways, though damaged, remained operational. Upon returning to their aircraft carriers, the Japanese pilots reported to Admiral Nagumo that the resistance at Midway had been stronger than expected, and that a second attack would be necessary to neutralize the island before invasion. This information would arrive at a terribly inopportune moment. Aboard his flagship, the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced the kind of dilemma that haunts commanders. The first wave of attack was returning from Midway. Simultaneously, a Japanese reconnaissance plane, which had taken off late, finally sent a shocking message. Sighted what appeared to be 10 enemy ships. Shortly after, an even more alarming update. The enemy is accompanied by an aircraft carrier. Suddenly, the battle scenario changed drastically. The main objective of Yamamoto's plan, to destroy the American aircraft carriers, was now within his grasp. But Nagumo was in a terrible position. His hangars were in a state of organized chaos. The planes of the second wave of attack had been armed with cluster and high-explosive bombs intended for land targets for the second attack on Midway that he had just authorized. Naval doctrine was clear. Against ships, the weapon of choice was the torpedo. Nagumo gave the order that would seal his fate. Rearm the planes, replace the bombs with torpedoes. This was no simple task. It required taking the planes down to the hangar, removing the heavy bombs, taking them back to the magazine, retrieving the even heavier torpedoes, and mounting them on the aircraft. It was a time-consuming, laborious, and extremely dangerous process. The hangar decks were filled with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses. The Japanese aircraft carriers at that moment were floating powder kegs. To complicate matters further, the planes from the first wave of the attack on Midway began to arrive, circling desperately with little fuel and some damaged. They needed to land. Nagumo had to make another fateful decision. Suspend the rearmament operation to collect the returning planes. This meant that his flight decks would be occupied and he would be unable to launch a counterattack for at least an hour. Indecision, rigid doctrine, and a bit of bad luck created the perfect window of vulnerability. Nagumo, waiting for the right moment to launch his devastating attack, didn't know he was no longer in control of time. And in the skies, silently approaching, was a squadron of American bombers that shouldn't even have been there.
Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was not a man given to grand speeches. He was an aviator, leader of Bombardment Squadron 6 aboard the USS Enterprise. His mission was simple: find and sink the Japanese aircraft carriers. He led 32 SBD Dauntless dive bombers toward the point where intelligence said Nagumo's fleet would be. But when they got there, they found only empty ocean. At that moment, McCluskey faced a choice that would define his life and the course of the war. Fuel was running low. The protocol was clear: if the target is not found, return to the ship. Returning was the logical decision, the safe decision. But something inside McCluskey, a hunter's instinct, told him that the enemy was close. He made a decision that broke all the rules. Instead of returning, he decided to continue the search, initiating a square search pattern. The minutes dragged on. The fuel gauges dropped dangerously. The tension in the cockpits was palpable. The mission was on the brink of failure. And then he saw it. Down below, a thin white line cutting across the blue of the ocean, the wake of a lone ship sailing at full speed northeast. It was the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which had stayed behind to attack an American submarine and was now racing to rejoin its main fleet. McCluskey couldn't know for sure, but his instinct screamed. He bet everything on that single clue. He changed course for his squadron and followed the destroyer. It was the biggest gamble of his life. A gamble made with the remaining fuel of his planes and the lives of his men. And it was the gamble that won the war. Because the Arashi's route led him, like Aradne's thread, directly to the vulnerable heart of the Kido Butai.
At 10:20 a.m. on June 4th, chaos reigned on the decks of the Japanese aircraft carriers. The planes for the attack on Midway had already landed. Ground crews scrambled to rearm and refuel the second wave for the attack on the American ships. The decks were crammed with planes, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. Nagumo was minutes away from launching his attack force. It was then that a lookout shouted, pointing to the sky. Emerging from the sun like avenging angels, Wade McCluskey's dauntless fighters plunged in. They had arrived at the most perfect and devastating moment possible. The Japanese Zero fighters, which had been drawn to sea level to counter American torpedo bomber attacks moments before, were out of position, struggling to gain altitude. There was nothing to stop the dive. The American pilots pushed their sticks forward, the planes diving almost vertically, the sound of the wind screaming in their ears. McCluskey and his men focused on the aircraft carrier Kaga. The 450-kilogram bombs were dropped. The first hit near the bridge. The others tore through the flight deck, plunging into the hangars packed with explosives. The Kaga was consumed by a series of cataclysmic explosions, turning into a floating pyre. Almost simultaneously, the Dauntless of Bombardment Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown, which arrived by a different route, found their own target, the Soryu. 3 bombs hit it in rapid succession. The result was the same, a hell of fire and steel. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Dick Best, leading his own bomber section from the Enterprise, realized that the Kaga and the Soryu were already doomed. He made a course correction at the last second and led his men toward the flagship, the Akagi. A single bomb, dropped by Best or one of his wingmen, penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, right in the middle of the piled-up bombs and torpedoes. The chain reaction was apocalyptic. In less than 5 minutes, the backbone of Japan's naval aviation was broken. 3 of the 4 carrier strikers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were ablaze, sinking, with their crews and elite pilots incinerated. The arrogance of victory sickness evaporated in the blink of an eye, replaced by the shock and horror of an unimaginable catastrophe.
Amid the chaos and smoke of the 3 burning aircraft carriers, one survived, the Hiryu. Led by Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, one of the most aggressive and respected commanders in the Imperial Navy, the Hiryu had separated slightly from the main formation and escaped the initial carnage. For Yamaguchi, the moment was not one of despair, but of revenge. He represented Japan's last hope in the battle, and he did not hesitate. Immediately, he ordered the launch of his first wave of attack, Val dive bombers, escorted by Zeros. The Target, the only American aircraft carrier the Japanese had managed to locate, the USS Yorktown. The planes from the Hiryu found the Yorktown and attacked with desperate fury. They penetrated the curtain of anti-aircraft fire and fighter patrols. 3 bombs hit the American aircraft carrier, causing severe damage. The Yorktown was left stranded in the water with fires on board and without power. It seemed to be out of action. But the Yorktown's damage control teams were miraculous. In just over an hour, they extinguished the fires, patched the flight deck, and restarted the boilers. The Yorktown, smoking but alive, began sailing again at 20 knots, ready to operate its aircraft. Yamaguchi, believing that the Yorktown had sunk and that he had encountered a second American aircraft carrier, launched his second and final wave of attack, Kate torpedo bombers. They found the same ship, the Yorktown, now underway. Once again, the Japanese pilots attacked with suicidal courage. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown on its starboard side, breaching the hull and causing a severe list. This time, the damage was fatal. The order to abandon ship was given.
The Hiryu had gotten its share of the meat. It had traded blow for blow and left an American aircraft carrier on the brink of destruction. But in launching its attacks, it had also revealed its position. And now, all the remaining force of American naval aviation was coming after him.
The news of the attack on the Yorktown and the location of the Hiryu galvanized the American task force. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had assumed command after his superior, Admiral Hazley, was hospitalized, ordered an immediate and all-out attack. From the USS Enterprise, a mixed force of 24 dive bombers took off, many of them without fighter escort. They were a patchwork of planes from different squadrons, including some from the Yorktown itself that had landed on the Enterprise. They flew toward the last known position of the Hiryu, the last serpent that needed its head cut off. They found it in the late afternoon. The Hiryu was sailing at full speed, its anti-aircraft guns ready, but there was no escape. The American Dauntless began their deadly dive. The sky around the Hiryu exploded with anti-aircraft artillery fire, but the bombers kept coming. At least four 450-kilogram bombs struck the aircraft carrier. One of them ripped the chunk out of the forward flight deck and hurled it against the bridge. Secondary explosions turned the ship's interior into a hell, just as its sister ships had suffered hours before. The Hiryu was doomed. Burning uncontrollably, it lost all propulsion and drifted. Admiral Yamaguchi, accepting defeat, gathered the remaining crew on deck, made one last speech, and, in a final act of loyalty to Bushido, chose to go down with his ship. With the Hiryu in flames, the backbone of the Kido Butai had been completely broken. The four giants, the invincible dragons of the Pacific, were all on their way to the bottom of the ocean. The greatest carrier strike force the world had ever seen had been annihilated in a single day. Aboard the super battleship Yamato, hundreds of kilometers away, Admiral Yamamoto received the fragmented and increasingly grim news. Disbelief gave way to shock, and shock to the bitter reality of defeat. His complex and arrogant plan had disintegrated. His precious aircraft carriers were lost. His dream of a decisive battle had turned into his worst nightmare. He briefly contemplated using his main battleship force for a desperate night battle, but without air cover, it would be suicide. The war had changed. Battleships were no longer the kings of the ocean. Reluctantly, in the early morning of June 5, Yamamoto gave the order that confirmed the magnitude of the disaster: a general retreat. The Japanese fleet, once so proud and imposing, turned and began the long and humiliating journey back home. Japan not only lost 4 of its most important aircraft carriers, it lost more than 250 aircraft, and, most devastating of all, it lost over 3,000 men, including 100 of its most experienced and irreplaceable pilots. Japan could build new ships and new planes, but it could not replace the combat experience and skill of an entire generation of naval aviators who went to the bottom of the sea with their ships. The Japanese government did everything to hide the truth from the nation. The survivors of the battle were quarantined so that news of the catastrophe would not leak out. Officially, Midway was portrayed as a victory, but in the Navy's high command, they knew the truth. Japan's offensive initiative in the Pacific had been permanently broken. From that day on, Japan would forever be on the defensive. The beginning of the end of its empire had begun. The Battle of Midway was not just a victory, It was a pivotal turning point in the history of naval warfare and World War II. Its legacy is multifaceted, a lesson on how wars are won and lost. Tactically, Midway was the ultimate confirmation that the aircraft carrier had supplanted the battleship as the capital of naval power. The battle was fought hundreds of miles apart by airplanes. The opposing fleets never saw each other. The era of gun duels was dead. The era of projecting air power over the sea had arrived. Technologically, the battle highlighted the critical importance of two tools, intelligence and radar. The ability to read enemy communications gave the Americans an asymmetrical advantage that overcame their numerical and material inferiority. It was an information victory. Radar, in turn, provided the early warning that, while it did not save the fighters at Midway, gave the American fleet and the island precious time to prepare. Morally, the impact was immense. For Japan, the defeat at Midway was a psychological blow from which it never recovered. The aura of invincibility was shattered. The victory sickness was cured by a brutal dose of reality. For the United States and the Allies, Midway was a ray of hope in the darkest hour. It proved that Japan could be defeated, that its war machine could be broken. The victory boosted morale on the home front and among the troops, giving them the belief that the long and bloody road to victory was, in fact, possible. Midway did not win the war. The war in the Pacific would continue for 3 more long and brutal years, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. But Midway was the moment the tide turned. Japan lost the ability to dictate the pace of the war. The United States, with its formidable industrial capacity now in full swing, gained the time it needed to build the overwhelming force that would ultimately lead to the final defeat of the Japanese Empire. In the silence that followed the storm, the Pacific Ocean became vast and indifferent once more. But beneath its waves now lay the wreckage of 4 titans, steel tombs for thousands of men and for the ambitions of an empire. Midway was more than a battle. It was a confluence of improbable events. It was the silent genius in a basement at Pearl Harbor. It was the arrogance of a plan too perfect to work. It was the desperate courage of pilots in obsolete machines. It was the fatal indecision of one admiral and the audacious instinct of another. It was an entire war, with all its drama, heroism, and tragedy condensed into a single fateful day. History teaches us that the destiny of nations can revolve around a very small axis. At Midway, that axis was 5 minutes. 5 minutes in which American dive bombers in the right place at the right time rewrote the future. From that June 4, 1942, the long road to Tokyo began. The sleeping giant was not merely awake, it was now on the march, and it would not stop. The Pacific, which for 6 months had been a Japanese lake, would never be the same again. And World War II would never forget the day when 4 invincible giants sank into the middle of nowhere, taking with them the rising sun of an empire.